because it defines progress possible because it defines the goals of history and gives it meaning. People do not normally associate the doctrine of salvation with the rescue of the meaning. People do not normally associate the doctrine of salvation with the rescue of meaning and definition, but the fact remains that, without the defined goal of salvation and historical and personal advance to the regeneration of all things as declared by God, history soon loses its focus and meaning. History becomes then, to cite the offhand remark of a philosopher, quote, just one damned fact after another, end quote. The refreshing cynic, Charles Fort, demonstrated the inability of science to define or to prove in a series of studies on dogmatism. Try again. The refreshing cynic, Charles Fort, demonstrated the inability of science to define or to prove in a series of studies on the dogmatism of science. Quote, what is a straight line? A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Well then, what is the shortest distance between 2 points? That is a straight line. According to the test of ages, the definition that a straight line is a straight line cannot be improved upon. I start with a logic as exacting as Euclid's. I shall be scientific about it, said Sir Isaac Newton, or virtually said he, quote, if there is no change in the direction of a moving body, the direction of a moving body is not changed, end quote. Quote, and blah, 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 blah. Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. But, continued he, quote, if something be changed, it is changed as much as it is changed, end quote. So red worms fell from the sky in Sweden because from the sky in Sweden red worms fell. That's a laugh. So, red worms fell from the sky in Sweden because from the sky in Sweden, red worms fell. How do the geologists determine the age of rocks? By the fossils in them. And how do they determine the age of the fossils? By the rocks therein. Having started with the logic of Euclid, I go on with the wisdom of a Newton. End quote. The thing to do was to accept it in its day, but Darwinianism, of course, was never proved. The fittest survive. What is meant by the fittest? Not the strongest, not the cleverest. Weakness and stupidity everywhere survive. There is no way of determining fitness except in that a thing does survive. Fitness, then, is only another term. Quote-unquote fitness, then, is only another name for survival. Darwinism, then survivors survive. What? I don't get that. Don't get how that should be read. Darwinism, then Darwinism. Darwinism, that survivors survive. The function of God is the focus. An intense mental state is impossible unless there be something or the illusion of something to centre upon. Fort's last statement barely opens the door to the fundamental issue. Life and thought alike need a focus of meaning. Men can briefly find a focus in humanistic goals, in wealth, power, status, sex, and experiences, but these soon pall. But these soon pall if life itself has no meaning. In the barest sense, history is movement in time, but if neither life nor movement have any meaning to man, then there is no focus nor history, nor any cause for movement, any progress toward a goal. Any progress towards a goal. And progress towards a goal. Guardini is right, quote, "The end determines all that precedes it," end quote. Where there is a faith in God's providence directing all history towards the triumph of the covenant people and exercising dominion over all the earth, towards the regeneration of men and the inclusion of all nations into God's covenant, and towards heaven, the resurrection of the body, and the new creation, there men will move and progress eagerly towards reconstructing all things in Christ and awaiting God's glorious fulfillment. Both history and thought find their meaning and focus in God. It is the end which determines all that precedes it. Without a valid end, thinking turns in itself and can define nothing. Define. Okay. I got it. Without a valid end, thinking turns in itself and can define nothing. Knowledge proceeds from knowledge, not from ignorance. The child learns because a body of knowledge exists, and it exists because the world is God's handiwork and is undergirded by His purpose, its meaning declared by His word, and His goals predestined and declared as immutable. Without the presupposition that the universe is an established and God-given order, man cannot relate fact to fact, nor fact to meaning. A straight line as the shortest distance between 2 points is an assertion which presupposes a universe of law and meaning reliably known by man in the framework of trustworthy mental processes and meanings. In a world of chance, the statement is meaningless. We have no problem with the statement that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points because we come to it with a vast body of presuppositions. Like a bow, it's not below. We have no problem with the statement that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points because we come to it with a vast body of presuppositions concerning reality. Moreover, we assume that, if someone should demonstrate that the statement is not necessarily true, it will only be in terms of another and profounder insight into the nature of reality. We presuppose a universe of law and meaning in terms of which definition is possible. To define is to determine precisely, to bring out the limits or outlines of something. There can be no definition unless God is either recognized or covertly presupposed, while outwardly denied. Van Til has said, quote, Suppose we think of a man made of water in an infinitely extended and bottomless ocean of water. Desiring to get out of water, he makes a ladder of water. He sets this ladder upon the water and against the water, and then attempts to climb out of the water. So hopeless and senseless a picture must be drawn of the natural man's methodology, based as it is upon the assumption that time or chance is ultimate. On his assumption, his own rationality is a... That's a misprint. On his assumption, his own rationality is a product of chance. On his assumption, even the laws of logic which he employs are product of chance. Aha, you see this reversed there? On his assumption, even the laws of logic which he employs are products of chance. The rationality and purpose that he may be searching for are still bound to be products of chance. Christian theism, which was first rejected because of its supposed authoritarian character, is the only position which gives human reason a field for successful operation and a method of true progress in knowledge. End quote. Let us return now to Fort's comments about the definition of a straight line. What Fort was pointing out was that scientists indulge in circular reasoning. Van Til, in affirming circular reasoning, has this to say, quote, "It thus appears that we must take the Bible, its conception of sin, its conception of Christ, and its conception of God and all that is involved in these concepts together, or take none of them. So also it makes very little difference whether we begin with the notion of an absolute God or with the notion of an absolute Bible. The one is derived from the other. They are together involved in the Christian view of life. Hence we defend all or we defend none. Only one absolute is possible, and only one absolute can speak to us. Hence it must speak to us at different places. The Bible must be true because it alone speaks of an absolute God. And equally true is that we believe in an absolute God because the Bible tells us of one. And this brings up the point of circular reasoning. The charge is constantly made that if matters stand thus with Christianity, it has written its own death warrant as far as intellectual men are concerned. Telebado. It has written its own death warrant as far as intelligent men are concerned. Who wishes to make such a simple blunder in elementary logic as to say that we believe something to be true because it is in the Bible? Our answer to this is briefly that we prefer to reason in a circle to not reasoning at all. We hold it to be true that circular reasoning is the only reasoning that is possible to finite man. The method of implication, as outlined above, is circular reasoning, or we may call it spiral reasoning. We must go round and round a thing to see more of its dimensions and to know more about it in general, unless we are larger than that which we are investigating. Unless we are larger than God, we cannot reason about him any other way than by transcendental or circular argument. The refusal to admit the necessity of circular reasoning is itself an evident token. The refusal to admit the necessity of circular reasoning is itself an evident token of opposition to Christianity. Reasoning in a vicious circle is the only alternative to reasoning in a circle as discussed above. End quote. Men either reason from God to God-given and God-interpreted facts, or they reason from man to man-made interpretations of brute factuality. All reason. All reasoning, Libo. All reason is circular reasoning. Man, as he claims autonomy from God, assumes that he can gain an infinite and exhaustive view of things, that he can, in brief, reason like God rather than as man. He then reasons in a vicious circle. He must then say, He must say then, if he is honest, that he cannot define... do it right. He must then say, if he is honest, that he cannot define straight or line or distance or anything else. Every item in his vicious circle hangs in mid-air on nothingness and is hence meaningless. His statement conveys meaning only because both he and his hearers presuppose the God of Scripture and his law order, whether they admit this fact or not. Reasoning is by presuppositions, whether men admit them or not. Autonomous man is anxious to gain an objective and godlike ability to see the totality of things exhaustively, and thus he denies the borrowed theistic presuppositions of his thought, whereas his professed presupposition of autonomy destroys the possibility of knowledge unless exhaustive knowledge is possible. If reality is what autonomous man claims it is, he can know nothing unless he knows everything. If reality is simply a product of chance, then it has no meaning or direction, nor does it have something about it that can be understood. It is then subject to no law, nor amenable to any control or use, because it lacks the character of consistency. However, if all reality, all the facts of nature and of history, are the product of God's total and predestinating plan, then all reality is already known by facts of nature and of history, are the product of God. It would be helpful if I turned the page. No. Plan, then all reality is already known by God who ordains it, controls it and predestines it, and it is potentially knowable to man truly and accurately, though not exhaustively. Reality is then knowable because it is not chance but pattern, it is governed by a purpose and a person, and it... No. Do it right. Reality is then knowable because it is not chance but pattern, it is governed by a purpose and person, and it is knowable to minds made in God's image. We then reason by presupposition to valid knowledge. As Van Til has pointed out, quote, to admit one's own presuppositions and to point out the presuppositions of others is therefore to maintain that all reasoning is, in the nature of the case, circular reasoning. The starting point, the method, and the conclusion are always involved in one another. Not good enough. Could be better. The starting point, the method, and the conclusion are always involved in one another. End quote. Since, quote, the starting point, the method, and the conclusion are always involved in one another, end quote, to avoid circular reasoning from God to God-given facts, and thence to conclusions, is to avoid reasoning at all, unless one covertly borrows the premises of God's order while denying it. To begin with nothing and to go to nothing adds up to nothing. Not surprisingly, the conclusion of autonomous philosophies is a despair of the possibility of knowledge. As Van Til has stated, I was careless. As Van Til has said, quote, the world, to exist at all, must exist as a theistic world, end quote. Moreover, quote, the only alternative to circular reasoning as engaged in by Christians, no matter on what point they speak, is that of reasoning on the basis of isolated facts and isolated minds, with the result that there is no possibility of reasoning at all. Unless as sinners we have an absolutely inspired Bible, we have no absolute God interpreting reality for us, and unless we have an absolute God interpreting reality for us, there is no true interpretation at all. This is not to deny that there is a true interpretation up to a point by those who do not self-consciously build upon the self-conscious God of Scripture as their ultimate reference point. Non-believers often speak the truth in spite of themselves. We're concerned to indicate that the absolute distinction between true and false must be maintained when a self-consciously adopted non-theistic and self-consciously adopted theistic point of view confront one another. End quote. Guardini was lazy reading. Guardini was thus right, quote, "The end determines all that precedes it," end quote, in reason as well as in life. The doctrine of progress fades when it is separated from the providence of God. Earlier, the first three sections of the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, quote, of providence, end quote, were cited. The remainder of that chapter is relevant to our present purpose. Quote, 4. The almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that it extendeth itself even to the first fall and all other sins of angels and men, and that not by a bare permission, but such as hath joined with it a most wise and powerful bounding, and together. Wise and powerful bounding, and otherwise ordering and governing of them in a manifold dispensation to his own holy ends, yet so as the sinfulness thereof proceedeth only from the creature, and not from God, who, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. 5. The most wise, righteous, and gracious God doth oftentimes leave for a season his own children to manifold temptations, and the corruption of their own hearts, to chastise them for their former sins, or to discover unto them the hidden strength of corruption and deceitfulness of their hearts, that they may be humbled. Deceitfulness of their hearts, that they may be humbled, and to raise them to a more close and constant dependence for their support upon himself, and to make them more watchful against all future occasions of sin, and for sundry other just and holy ends. 6. As for those wicked and ungodly men whom God, as a righteous judge for former sins, doth blind and harden, from them he not only withholdeth his grace, whereby they might have been enlightened in their understandings, and wrought upon in their hearts, but sometimes also withdraweth the gifts which they had, and exposeth them to such objects as their corruption makes occasion of sin, and withal gives them over to their own lusts, the temptations of the world, and the power of Satan, whereby it comes to pass that they harden themselves, even under those means which God useth for the softening of others. 7. As the providence of God doth, in general, reach to all creatures, so, after a most special manner, it taketh care of his church, and disposeth all things to the good thereof. End quote. As Clarke has pointed out, the doctrines of predestination and providence both show God's controlling power over all things. Predestination declares the foreordination of all things by God, and it is specific and particular. Providence declares the care exercised by God over all the universe, and the ordering of all things in terms of his glorious purpose. Neither doctrine can be confused with fatalism, which denies, quote, that the universe has a purpose. Natural processes seem not to be detected to any foreseen end. End quote. Fatalism sees a mindless, purposeless regularity to things. In the popular view of fatalism, man can do nothing to avert the things which shall come to pass. As against this, providence and predestination teach the responsibility of man and the necessity for action by man. Providence is a doctrine which assures us that those who do Providence is a doctrine which assures us that those who believe in God through grace and who obey God's law have the assurance and certainty of His glorious victory. The end established by God also determines all that precedes it in their lives and in all things around them. In terms of that end, victory in time and eternity, a new creation and the resurrection of the body, the believer moves providentially. He is future-oriented. He knows what his destiny is, and he cannot live only in terms of the hour. If this faith is denied, man reacts logically to death as the end. St. Paul cited the attitude common in his day, quote, "What advantageth it me if the dead rise not? Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." 1 Corinthians 15:32. The end logically determines all that precedes it. And despite efforts of men to forestall the logic of the end by positing a different way that And despite efforts of men to forestall the logic of the end by positing a different way thereto, the end soon casts its shadow on different way thereto. The end soon casts its shadow of meaningless over a different way thereto. The end soon casts its shadow of meaninglessness over all their lives. The poet James Thomson, 1834 to 1882, came to believe that, quote, "The world rolls around forever like a mill. It grinds out death and life and good and ill. It has no purpose, heart, or mind or will." Believing this, he consistently and logically refused to believe that the life... I like to insert words randomly. Believing this, he consistently and logically refused to believe that life could add up to any meaning. Instead, he faced it with the conviction and the sense that every struggle brings defeat. Because fate holds no prize to crown success, that all the oracles are dumb or cheat, because they have no secret to express, that none can pierce the vast black veil uncertain, because there is no light beyond the curtain, that all is vanity and nothingness. End quote. Not all who shared Thomson's belief in an ultimate nothingness were as logical as he, but sooner or later an epistemological self-consciousness set in, an awareness of what their faith implied. If, quote, there is no light beyond the curtain, end quote, then indeed, quote, all is vanity and nothingness, end quote. The history of civilizations and cultures amply demonstrates that indeed, quote, the end determines all that precedes it, end quote. The biblical doctrine of salvation thus is not only an assurance of future bliss, but also of present strength, hope, and victory. "Let us eat and drink," said the cynics of the Roman Empire, "for tomorrow we die." Earlier the proverb had been, "Let us eat, drink, and merry." And merry, surely it's be merry. Earlier the proverb had been, "Let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," but now even merriment was disappearing from life. The economics of this proverb was an economy geared to quick consumption without concern for the future, and this meant the erosion of tomorrow. A similar attitude prevails in the 20th century. In 1909, C.W. Eliot, for many years president of Harvard, said in a commemoration address, quote, "The religion of the future should concern itself with the needs of the present, with public baths, playgrounds, wider and cleaner streets, and better buildings." End quote. Living Buzz noise. Living for the moment means surrendering any hope for the future. It means an economy, in Rupke's words, in which it is, quote, a virtue to contract debts and foolishness to save, end quote. Moreover, quote, it is no accident that Keynes, and nobody is more responsible for this tendency among economists than he, has reaped fame and admiration for his equally banal and cynical observation that, quote, in the end, in the long run, follow me. In the long run, we are all dead, end quote. This is a philosophy of suicide. Its desired and expected end is death. So that was a cheery one, another cheery one, another good one. Light. I would describe it as light. Frothy, even. Frothy. Like tabloid-esque. Frothy, light. All right, folks, so thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.